The old shoe salesman wasn't as spry as he used to be, a fact his aching and crackling joints made abundantly clear to him each and every morning when he climbed up out of bed. But he found that once he got a few cups of strong coffee in him, he didn't feel all that bad. Real coffee, though, not chicory. He'd had more than enough of that as a youngster. Morning cup of joe notwithstanding, he still wasn't moving briskly enough to suit the loudmouthed customer he was currently attending. "Don't you know who I am?" the blowhard shouted. "I'm Bill Duggans, and I've got a mind to bust you upside the head if you don't find me the boots I want." Yikes. Obviously, whoever said that the customer is always right never worked retail, and they certainly never encountered the likes of Bill Duggans. Now, I don't know what this guy Duggans looked like, but I'd be willing to bet he was on the bigger side. The kind of man used to throwing his weight around and bullying those that were smaller or weaker than him. I mean, I think we all know the truth about bullies, right? How they're really just cowards at heart and only pick on easy targets, those they don't consider a threat. In this case, Bill Duggans was picking on what looked to be just an old man working at a shoe store. Ah, but looks can be deceiving. And sometimes a man will tell you all you need to know about him without even saying a word. Only you'll just pay attention. Take the shoe salesman, for example. If the loudmouth bully had been the observant type, maybe he'd have noticed that the old man sure didn't have the looks of a guy who spent a lifetime selling shoes. The wrinkles around the eyes, for instance, indicated time spent out of doors, squinting at the sun. And the way he walked, kind of awkward, a little bow-legged with a slight limp. A walk that you'd expect from a man accustomed to long hours in the saddle, as opposed to the confines of a department store. And even if Duggans had noticed the limp, he'd probably just snidely explain it away as arthritis or old age, never stopping to entertain the idea that it might just be the result of a hip once shattered by a .36 caliber ball, and then not furthering that thought with the notion that maybe this old shoe salesman had other scars from other bullets. Or if he had, maybe he just dismissed the salesman as being yet another old veteran. Most men his age were, but hell, most of them were broken, and the stories they told were all lies anyway, most likely. Why, if only Bill Duggans had been around during the war, he'd have shown those damn Yankees a thing or two. Maybe. And maybe if Duggans had taken the time to speak with the other employees, he'd have gleefully sneered at the stories they told of the soft-spoken shoe salesman who was easily startled by loud, unexpected noises. Noises of the sort that didn't have any effect on a brave man such as Duggans. But I wonder if he would have also paid attention as the same employees spoke about how the old man never let anybody walk up too close behind him. How no matter how hard you tried, you just couldn't sneak up on him. He just always seemed to know that you were there. And I'm fairly certain that if the old man's co-workers were to share his fondness for quoting Shakespeare, or his tendency to volunteer at the church teaching Sunday school, that would have only emboldened the bully even more, and blind him to the signs that were there and obvious for anyone willing to just pay attention. Signs like the total lack of fear in the old man's eyes. And not just a lack of fear, something else. Something the bully had probably never yet encountered during one of his tirades. A twinkle of amusement. The situation had to be amusing for the old shoe salesman, who hadn't always been a shoe salesman. But still the bully had asked him a question, one that he was going to make an honest attempt at answering. Had he ever heard of this brute before, he wondered, as he began turning the name over in his head? Bill Duggans. Bill Duggans. Was this here Bill Duggans around back in '61 when he heeded the call? Back before we found out that he was just a mere mortal at places like Lexington and Wilson's Creek? No, not that he could recall. Nor could he recall anyone by the name of Duggans who rode with Captain Scott or Quantrill or Bill Anderson. Especially not on that terrible day in the ravines when their ammunition ran out and they took to fight with club rifles and fists and rocks. No, the name of every man he fought with that day was carved into the very core of his being, and none of them were named Duggans. And try as he might, he just couldn't place a Bill Duggans among those whom he accompanied to Lawrence the day he and the boys sold their souls to the devil and set the Jayhawkers straight. The old shoe salesman's mind scanned over the past few decades. He saw the faces of men he'd known, guys like George Todd, Clell Miller, and Charlie Pitts, that brave yet foolish banker up in Minnesota by the name of Haywood, and others, some of which he couldn't put names to, but as far as he could remember, none of them were called Duggans. And there damn sure wasn't no Duggans present back in '82 when the old man became a temporary guest of the government. Finally, the old shoe salesman looked up at the loudmouth and replied, "No, I don't think I know who you are. Do you know who I am, Mr. Duggans?" "Nah, who are you?" "My name's Frank James. Perhaps you heard of me or my brother Jesse." The story then goes that Bill Duggans all of a sudden turned pale, started trembling, and very quickly decided he liked the boots he already had just fine. Within moments he was gone, probably to go find a fresh pair of underwear. Now I don't know if that story's true. It's one of the many tales that you can find on the internet when researching Frank James. I'm not sure when it was first printed, and there's no way that I know of to verify its accuracy. And even if it is true, I'm sure it's at least been slightly embellished over the years. I'm not ashamed to say that I even took liberties myself when sharing it just now. But the fact is, the older brother of Jesse James, Alexander Franklin James, did sell shoes in his old age at Sanger's in Dallas, Texas. It was one of the many odd jobs he took up after he got out of jail. In addition to selling shoes, he also punched tickets for a burlesque show, picked berries, gave lectures, and even worked for AT&T, until he finally settled down on the family farm in Missouri, where he died in 1915 at the age of 72. So whether or not there was ever any Bill Duggans is up for debate, but surely at some point some cocky kid, some local bully or pompous blowhard did brush shoulders with the notorious Frank James without knowing who he was. Maybe cursed at him for walking too slow or for accidentally bumping into him, not knowing that they were just talking to a man who could kill them 4 times over before breakfast and then go home and sleep like a baby. And I gotta wonder what Frank thought of such men, guys like Bill Duggans, who walked around seemingly begging for death without even knowing it. Men who wouldn't make a pimple on a tough man's ass, or hold a candle to the likes of those he rode with back when the West was still wild, and the air was permeated with the black powder smoke. A lot of people idolize the James brothers, put them up on a pedestal as freedom fighters or Robin Hood types, and that's not what I'm doing here. I just think it's an interesting story. But there's no disputing the fact that Frank James was a dangerous man. He never drank or used foul language, but he sure as hell left plenty of grieving mothers in his wake, and so did his little brother. Frank James wasn't no hero, but he was a product of his times. And like I always say, history is complicated. On one hand, I think everybody is responsible for everything they do. Nobody forced Frank James into a life of crime. But on the other hand, I figure he and Jesse had about as much chance of going straight after the war as a young kid nowadays in Mexico does, growing up in a poor barrio where the only way to feed his family is to become a sicario for one of the cartels. The type of life that causes people to make choices that the more privileged among us don't have to make. Choices I've never had to make. Choices that lead to a lifestyle that sickens a man's soul. But I do believe there's redemption in this world. At least I hope to God there is for my own sake. And maybe Frank James found that redemption in his later years, doing honest work, and ignoring that inner voice that surely was telling him to end Bill Duggans' existence the same way that you or I would casually swat a mosquito. Anyway, fun to think about. And something to keep in mind the next time you're out in the world feeling yourself. Maybe don't rush to anger or mouth off at someone who you don't know anything about. There are still killers among us, just like in Bill Duggans' time. And they might not all be as patient as Frank James. Alright, y'all, that's about all I've got for today. If you're new to Bloody Beaver Podcast, my name is Josh, and what you just heard was what I like to call a Bloody Beaver Quickie. And for you repeat customers, I know, another short one, but have no fear, a full-length episode is in the works. And it's going to be on another tough old man, a guy named Bill Tillman. Bill came up in Dodge City with Wyatt Earp and Bat Masterson and Luke Short. He was friends with Doc Holliday. He himself would actually become the city marshal there in Dodge before moving on to Oklahoma and becoming a U.S. deputy marshal under Judge Parker. This guy took on the dueling gang and lived long enough to go into the movie business. Ended up coming out of retirement at the age of 70 and putting a badge on once again. It's going to be a really interesting episode, so please stay tuned. And please feel free to contact me at bloodybeaverpodcast@gmail.com. Or head on over to bloodybeaver.com and hit that contact button. And while you're there, check out some of my other episodes. 37 all total now. Granted, many of them aren't very good, but they are there. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe and tell other people about the podcast. Be a Bloody Beaver super spreader. All right, y'all. Adios.